capable and able to respond fast enough to this new normal. Tonight we discuss the Caribbean norm, how are governments throughout the region responding to this threat and the crisis. Is enough support being given to the private sector? Is it a hand-holding exercise? And what really is the role of international lending agencies? And who is really going to be borrowing? Tonight we discuss these issues and so much more. It's a wide-ranging discussion. We'll be hearing perspectives from the Prime Minister of Guyana to the country head of the Inter-American Development Bank and also senior officials from the Caribbean Development Bank. But we at this time going to start our conversation looking at St. Lucia. Now get this, as of April 14th, 2020, St. Lucia had an official confirmed case count of 15. That's 15 confirmed cases of COVID-19. Follow-up tests were also conducted on confirmed cases in care. And to date, a total of 11 of the confirmed 15 COVID-19 patients have recovered. Presently, there are 25 persons in quarantine and 20 in isolation. St. Lucia continues a 10-hour curfew from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m. daily. Some of the national protocols which apply to this include remaining at home and leaving only for food or medical purposes, avoid mass crowds or events, social gatherings. And like other Caribbean islands, its economy is driven by tourism. And with this sector almost ground to a complete halt, how will this island rebound, retool, and survive? Joining us tonight for a discussion, a wide-ranging discussion, and to kick off our discussion, our panels tonight, we have Prime Minister Alan Chastanet. Prime Minister, good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Now, I'm going to start with the first question, obviously. You are one of the first Caribbean countries to declare a state of emergency, while others were simply adopting a more measured approach, a wait-and-see approach. Why go straight for the jugular and start a state of emergency?
Well, we certainly didn't go straight for the jugular. I mean, our interventions with COVID really started back in early February. And one of the first threats that we had, and that's not taking anything away from them, was the cruise sector. And that's why, working with the current chairperson of CARICOM, Prime Minister Motley, we called for a meeting that took place in Barbados to look at the protocols that we would adopt in dealing with the cruise industry. And so our intervention started from that point. The decision to go to a 24-hour curfew or creating an emergency, a state of emergency, came out of necessity. So the first thing that happened to us is when we decided to bring St. Lucians back home, into St. Lucia, we quickly realized that the choice of putting people into voluntary quarantining did not work. And so therefore the decision was made to go to compulsory quarantining. And so we were able to adopt 3 hotels to be able to do that. And within no time, the hotels were full. And we started realizing that the human resources, the nurses that we needed, the police officers that we needed, that we couldn't cope anymore. And so we had to shut our borders at that point. Once we started finding cases in St. Lucia of persons who had come in, and we started doing the contact tracing, with the first 5 cases, we had to put 100 people into compulsory quarantining. So now we knew that we certainly did not have enough capacity to put everyone into compulsory quarantining administratively. So what we had to do was to put every single St. Lucian into quarantining. And why did we have to do that? Is because we were not doing enough testing. We didn't have a capability to do enough testing. And so we wouldn't know for sure if we had a community outbreak. Now, putting everybody into compulsory quarantining, and the only way to enforce that was by declaring a state of emergency and putting a 24-hour curfew. So the 24-hour curfew was simply to assist us in enforcing the quarantining for everyone.
How has, looking at that quarantine, and now you have a curfew intact, let me ask the big question about the economy, and how has St. Lucia's economy changed?
Well, it's been devastating. I mean, I think that all of us were caught. The fact that all of a sudden your tourism revenue went to zero. I remember having the discussions with the governor of our central bank almost a month before we went to the emergency section. And I said to him, Governor, how do you assess the economic impact when you consider we're going to have zero tourism arrivals? And I think it was a concept very difficult for people to visualize zero, but it was zero. And then to make things worse, you had to shut down your local economy. And so this is the fallout that we're currently dealing with of a zero revenue coming into government. And meanwhile, you still have your salaries, you still have debt payments, and other projects to be able to continue. And it's to find that liquidity to be able to move on that's been an incredible challenge.
You talk about the incredible challenge and liquidity. Obviously, you're looking at either international funding, loan agencies, or fiscal adjustments. What adjustments is the government making or you're doing to cushion the fallout and to save your economy?
So a couple of things. The liquidity really came, first of all, with our central bank working with our regional and national banks, being able to give, for the first time, a blanket moratorium on interest and principal for individuals, corporations, and also for the government. So that created some immediate liquidity for us. We've been negotiating overdraft facilities with those commercial institutions, as well as drawing on some additional funds from our central bank. Now, the ECCB, our Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, is a very different animal to many central banks in the world. As you know, the Eastern Caribbean dollar is pegged to the US dollar. Mm-hmm. So to sustain that, they have to maintain a certain amount of reserves. So the prudential level, the legal level is 60%. But we've constantly been at the number of 100%, well over the prudential levels that are being advised for us. So our central bank doesn't have the ability of buying treasury bills or buying bonds like what you see is taking place in the United States and Canada, Europe, all around the world, where in essence, they're buying these bills and creating immediate liquidity for those governments. We don't have that luxury. So we have been in discussions with the CDB in terms of getting a policy-based loan, and also we borrowed money to pay for our interest and principal for the entire year. We've also been working with the International Monetary Fund. They have what's called a rapid response facility, and they've now doubled the amount because of this crisis to countries like ours. And we're now also in discussions with the central bank about some other quantitative easing that they might be able to do for us. But this is where the liquidity has come from and able to meet the difference. And we're obviously in negotiations with our unions and many of our suppliers to determine a way forward.
Now, you talk about discussions with the unions, and I want to ask, the business community, and I know that you have not just remittances, but you have a huge FDI, you have a lot of foreign investments in St. Lucia. How are you marrying all of the interests? Are you having dialogue with the unions, with the business community? How are you all working together to reshape and retool your economy?
Well, it's an ongoing process, dialogue, and with developing trust. So we have done presentations to the unions. We've had 4 meetings to date. We've also met with the private sector entities. We stay very close with our banking institutions and also our central bank, and we're working with CDB, the World Bank, and as indicated, the IMF. So the good thing is numbers don't lie. So we knew what our revenue was on a monthly basis pre-COVID. We have an estimate as to what we think that money is going to be. We have the turnovers of our bonds and treasury bills. So we have to be able to meet those demands if necessary. We're obligated to continue to meet our debt obligations, because what you don't want to do is to be in default, because if you're in default, then it takes away all the other options that you have on the table. So it's a continuous case of dialogue, and sadly, there is a lot of uncertainty. Nobody knows when the market's going to open back up again. Nobody knows when the market opens back up, how large it's going to be and how long it's going to take to recover. And we continuously hear new numbers every single day. So there becomes a point where there is the crisis, and you're dealing with the immediate crisis, and then there is opening up your local economy, which will now start generating, but you cannot open up your local economy until you have the COVID, particularly in your communities, under control. And then once you've opened up your local economy, the next one is, when can we start thinking of reopening our international borders? What's that going to look like? And what's going to be the fallout in the rest of the world. And I think that there was an economist, and I think that he put it really well. He said that the world has gone into an induced coma. And as you know, that doctors would use the process of an induced coma to save other organs. And it's not until you actually bring that person out of coma that they would understand what the impact on the other organs has been. It's the same thing. We're not going to know the complete fallout and the impact on our economies until the world reopens.
Now, I know that recently you opened a hospital in St. Lucia. Explain to me how you're preparing for the pandemic. I see other islands, other areas are using a parallel care system to address that. You mentioned earlier about the quarantine. How are you readjusting your health system to deal with this?
It's really difficult. So we had received a new hospital from the Europeans. We were in the process of trying to open it. We were proposing to open it sometime in August of this year. When this pandemic hit and with the problems that we had, we decided to move forward and push that forward, which we have. And it was very difficult because we were supposed to be getting a specialist team from Martinique to help us in that transition. We're contracting an Indian firm that does the Cayman House City project. They couldn't get here. So we ended up having to rely on our local doctors and medical fraternity to assist us in making that transition. Making that transition was very important because what we wanted to do was to free up the old hospital to become a respiratory hospital. So we've now got that up and running, and we moved very quickly, very early to engage Cuba and to get 110 doctors and nurses to be here. So they've been now here for 3 weeks. They're fully certified. They're going through the orientation process. So what our goal with COVID all the time was to delay, because we always knew that we could not handle what's happening in New York City or what's happening in Italy. So we always erred on the side of caution because we knew the fallout position was so draconian and so catastrophic.
How long can you continue like this? You talk about the borders being shut, and I know we have about 2 or 3 minutes again. How long can St. Lucia survive like this?
Well, you know, everybody has survival instincts. I mean, at the end of the day, we all have to survive. So, for instance, what we've continued to do is to use the word rationing. When we didn't do an economic stimulus program. We did what was called a social stabilization to provide subsistence allowances for the persons who were affected, literally for them to be able to buy meals. We're working with our hotel association and our farmers, and we're now producing, this weekend we produced 2,700 meals. Next weekend, we're producing 5,000 meals a day, and then we hope to be able to grow that to 10,000 meals a day. And we've just done a telethon to raise funds. We were able to raise over $1 million in one night to be able to support purchasing PPEs and also to support the feeding program. So people need to come together and realize that this is the new temporary normal. This is not the short-term, medium-term, or long-term. This is the crisis normal that requires rationing. And that once you now understand what's going to happen, then you can put together a short-term, a medium-term, and a long-term plan.
Prime Minister, in the little time that we have, I want to ask 2 questions. One about the banks. Have you gotten loan deferrals or any sort of commitment from the banks, as we've seen in other islands?
We have. We were instrumental in negotiating with the central bank and also with our commercial banks and regional banks very early in the game. So it was not a surprise, because I always knew that it would take them a time to be able to assess the situation. So I think that our assessment of the situation, we gave it to them early. I think it was shocking, but when they started realizing that our predictions were coming through, it gave my government much more credibility. And I think that we were very instrumental in getting that kind of moratorium.
Looking at the CARICOM perspective, and this is my final question to you, I know the CARICOM had a meeting. You said that there was a meeting earlier that happened because you started the discussions. Do you think, one, that the decisions are being made is in the best interest, and the implementation to ensure that countries like St. Lucia that are so dependent on tourism can actually survive beyond COVID?
Absolutely. I mean, the fact is that we now know that we have to coexist with COVID. And we know that contact tracing and social distancing works. So if we know that, how can we create a protocol to allow tourists to be able to come back into our country? So we're looking at things like, all right, can we reopen some of the hotels? Can we use rapid testing so that we know 80% of the time that that's going to be accurate? When the persons come here, that we actually create the hotel as an enclave industry and allow our workers to actually live at the hotels for a period of time until we gain confidence in the protocols we're establishing. So that if in fact you do have a breakout, now you've been able to isolate it. So these persons are not going back to their homes on a daily basis. That's the point of creating an enclave. But we have put together a paper. We are working with the Caribbean Hotels Association, CTO, the airlines, World Bank. We're hoping to be able to, the University of West Indies and other entities, to be able to figure out what that protocol is. Because sadly, the WHO and PAHO, as good as they are, I'm not so sure that they have the time right now to be looking at the next steps. So we have to anticipate where that's going to go and to understand that the world cannot remain closed for much longer. It's not just about St. Lucia, but the whole economic platform that we have right now is in jeopardy. And most businesses and governments around the world would agree. So we've learned to coexist with diabetes, with cancer, with HIV, and many other viruses that we don't have cures for. We're now going to have to figure out how to coexist with COVID. We understand it a lot better than we did before. Right. We're going to have to put those protocols and move forward.
Prime Minister, I do want to thank you very much. I know you had a very long day, so I do appreciate you taking our call from a long day of meetings. That's Prime Minister Alan Chastany there of St. Lucia, talking about exactly what's taking place, not just in his island, but as he said, they can't remain closed for much longer. A curfew still exists, but he said that the call for a state of emergency needed to be done because they do not have the infrastructure as New York and others to support a crash in the health system. We take a very short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about a regional perspective. We look at the role of international lending agencies in saving the Caribbean economy.
The COVID-19 virus, previously called novel coronavirus, is part of a family of viruses that includes the common cold and other respiratory syndromes. Protect yourself and loved ones from COVID-19 by washing your hands with soap and water or using an alcohol-based hand sanitizer, avoiding close contact with persons who are sick, and by covering your nose and mouth with disposable tissue when you cough or sneeze. Discard the tissue immediately or sneeze into the crook of your elbow if you do not have a tissue. Ensure to thoroughly cook meat and eggs before consumption. If you develop fever, cough, or difficulty breathing after coming from a country with the COVID-19 virus, please seek medical attention at the nearest health institution. Remember, prevention is the most important action you can take to protect yourself and your family from getting COVID-19. A message from the Ministry of Health.
And low price is the number one. We have discount in every section, Miss Lady. And low price is the number one. We shopping by Anand's Day. We shopping by Anand's Day. Oh Lord.
Anand's Low Price Supermarket. Come visit a frequently clean and sanitized environment. Fully stocked with the lowest prices. Come spend $1,000 or more and get a free 10-pound bag of potatoes.
At this point in time, I really like the Spanish section. I'm glad I like it. Like to know everything, what is going on with us.
Also, I think the editorials, I think they're doing a good job and they're speaking the truths, and you know they're challenging the government to make things better.
Me in particular, of recently, the last 2-3 months, I've been reading The Guardian. I'm seeing a lot of news about the neighborhoods and the communities, and I even saw my community featured, and I was proud.
Oh, The Guardian.
The Guardian?
Guardian.
Trinidad Guardian.
The Guardian.
The Guardian.
Trinidad Guardian. The Guardian is my first choice.
Welcome back to Trinidad and Tobago. We are continuing our conversation navigating the crisis, the Caribbean economy, the new norm. Now, the COVID-19 outbreak could have considerable implications for Caribbean citizens and life as we know it. The magnitude of this impact will depend crucially on the spread of this virus, a virus that we are yet to understand, the duration of the outbreak, and the measures that we in the region and elsewhere are taken to not only insulate ourselves, but also to survive this time and beyond. But the bigger questions, what will the post-Caribbean economy look like? Joining us to explore these issues in detail, a lot more detail that is, we have the head of IDB, that's IDB in the country head, that's Rusio Medina Bolivar. I hope I got that pronunciation right with the little Spanish twang there. And also we have Dr. Justin Ram, he's a Director of Economics at the Caribbean Development Bank. Good evening, thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Helen.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Rusio, let me start with you in terms of the impact. I know that the IDB has released a number of studies on this, and you're looking and monitoring this. You've even had a number of seminars and webinars trying to assist Caribbean regions. From what you've seen, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the Caribbean region from December till now?
Well, definitely the impact has been really big. I mean, I think we have seen the World Economic Outlook recently, and the numbers in terms of the regions and the projections of growth of the whole Latin America and the Caribbean has been changed dramatically due to COVID-19. So the countries, I would say, has been revealing different type of impacts, I would say, especially if we focus on the Caribbean region, because there are different external shocks that are affecting. Definitely COVID-19 affecting very hardly the tourism, because affecting the airlines, the cruises, and all the industries for more countries that are more, that have tourism as a relevant sector. Like Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, and you have the other countries that you can also see a different external shocks affecting that are more reliant on commodity-driven economies like Trinidad and Tobago, on where you have the combination of the effect of the COVID-19 and the oil and gas prices that has been definitely going down dramatically. So the combination of both has been impacted tremendously the Caribbean region, but I would say worldwide, the forecast has been changed dramatically to negative and contractions in the whole Latin America and the Caribbean.
Now, Justin, I want to bring you into the conversation now, and you wrote a paper, and I don't want to misquote this, but you started the introduction saying Caribbean economies are likely to be scarred and left with permanent damage. That was in the introductory paragraph of your paper. That's a pretty pessimistic outlook and a pretty pessimistic opening. Are things that bad?
Yes, well, thanks, Hema. Thanks for having me. Well, you have to remember that on top of what the COVID-19 crisis brings to Caribbean economies, we were already had a situation where many of our economies were not growing at the rates that would be sufficient to take many people out of poverty or to bring greater levels of employment. We also had fairly high levels of debt in the Caribbean. Some countries have been dealing with that recently, but that just means that when you layer on top of the existing challenges that we had in the Caribbean, and now you put on top of that the COVID-19 challenges, you can expect the Caribbean to come out with deep structural flaws in the economy. But let me just make it clear that it is not only as a result of COVID-19. Many of those structural flaws were there. And we really now have an opportunity, and that's why I wrote the paper, to now take this challenge, this difficult time, and do the type of reforms that I think we need to see in the Caribbean to put us on a much more resilient path.
Now, Rusio, I'm looking at the IDB assistance. What form is the IDB assisting Caribbean countries? Because you look at the vulnerable states, and you are right, we have tourism-driven economies. We also have those that are dependent on aid. You have those that are also dependent on remittances. So there's so many things that add to our revenue stream. How is the IDB assisting in adjusting to this new normal?
Well, the IDB, I think, actually as a group, are actually attending and to help not only the governments like Trinidad and Tobago, but also the private sector. I mean, we have different windows that are supporting right now how to address the COVID-19 crisis. In the public sector specifically, I would say the bank has divided in 4 pillars our interventions. The first one, I would say, is how to strengthen the public health response of countries. So how to strengthen and improve the capacity to deal with the people who are sick, and how you actually move it to outside of that illness. Secondly, is how we can support, as a second pillar, is to create a social safety net for the vulnerable population that is being affected by the mitigation measures that countries are taking in order to address the COVID-19, like social distance and other. Third is how we protect businesses. Businesses avoid to go into bankruptcy, especially the ones that are more productive and more competitive, and also how we protect the formal employment. And lastly, I would say is how actually we work on the fiscal policies to introduce all these measures in order to how to see a medium-term outlook after the post-pandemic. So these four pillars is the IDB has put in extra resources actually to support the Latin American and the Caribbean. I mean, more than $3 billion that we are putting to work on new resources and actually fast-tracking our approval processes, and also working also with the private sector. We are putting more resources. We expect at least $5 billion for the whole Latin America and the Caribbean, and at least 10% to go to the Caribbean to work and strengthen the response capacity of private sector that are actually working right now and are being affected by the crisis.
Now, you mentioned private sector, and I want to ask Justin a question on that note. Justin, I know in your paper you spoke about retooling and the work of the private sector. Now, the banks have offered preferential rates, and we're also looking at the allowances that the government has given. Was it enough assistance to allow the manufacturing sector and others in the business community to retool and readjust their process?
Well, Hima, I think that we have to also look at the original doing business environment within many of our countries. So it's one thing that our governments need to provide financial support at this time. So I just want to reiterate that during this flattening of the pandemic curve, it's important that the government provides support to the private sector and to labor as well. But I think what is going to be more important as we come out of this is that we have to look at a policy reform program that tries to improve the business environment in all of the Caribbean countries. That, I think, is what will help us to build resilience after this. Because ultimately, Hima, when we look at our Caribbean countries, the problem that we have is that many of the economies are not diversified. We are standing on one leg. So in the case of many of the countries, it's tourism. In some of the commodity countries, it's oil and natural gas, for example. We need to look at how we diversify. Diversification is what helps you build resilience. And I think that what governments will need to look at are the policy reforms that takes away the red tape and help businesses and entrepreneurs to now be entrepreneurial, to take up, to see new opportunities in the economy and to start doing things that now seem to be too difficult. So yes, financial support is important, but I think it's really important that we look at the policy environment and to improve the doing business environment in particular.
Rishi, I know you mentioned that the IDB is working with the private sector to assist in adjusting to this new norm. Can you give us some examples as to exactly how you're assisting the private sector in rising to the challenge?
I mean, we have, for the private sector, we have two windows. I would say one is IDB Invest, who work, I think, is our largest private sector financier window, and that work with financial institutions, with private sector companies, etc. What we're seeing is it will be a new normal in terms of supply chain, in terms of how the logistic will work, how the financing actually that the companies will be needed in order to adapt to the business continuity. I mean, it will be definitely this crisis is putting in more evidence the challenges the companies and the public sector, a whole the region are affecting because are not preparing, necessarily ready to do teleworking, for instance, or have the policies in place. And also that's applied for the public sector, but also for the private sector. Also, we were experienced before the crisis the needs for the private sector and the public to think on the future of work, adopt of technology. Technology is crucial. So this is one of the investments and the companies need to be done. And the private IDB Invest it will support those investments to be ready, not only for the short term, but actually how they will work on the post-pandemic. Additionally, with our other private sector window called IDB Lab, which is our innovation lab for both the private and the public sector. We're trying to identify innovative solutions that actually can work and support to find solutions for the crisis. I just can mention we have recently a call for proposals for the whole Latin America and the Caribbean. We received more than 500 proposals, and we're financing, for instance, one in Trinidad and Tobago that actually will create a prescription platform, digital, that will be addressed and will be very helpful for the vulnerable population like the adults. For instance, now they cannot go have an access and they need to have access to prescriptions. And that will not be only COVID, it will be also it will be applicable for other important non-communicable diseases. That is a big problem for the Caribbean.
Now, I do want to ask you both to stay on the line because we're going to take a very short break. And when we come back, we're going to find out what exactly the post-COVID Caribbean economy will look like. And as we talk about retooling the private sector and the public sector, who will really survive this pandemic that we are yet to fully understand? Stay with us. This is Navigating the Crisis.
Hey, what are you watching there, man?
The latest Denzel movie, the one that now showing in cinema.
The latest? But how you getting to see that? The people who make that Tanyak appear?
It's an app I have on my Android box. With that app, I get to see the latest movies and best TV shows. And here what? For free.
For free? You know that's stealing, right?
Talking about, boy.
Boy, when these people take these movies and share them, they're stealing. They're sharing something that don't belong to them.
Why hurting by watching a little movie on my app?
Big man, copyright is serious business. If everybody do like you and watch movies for free, like if it have no tomorrow, go happen to the movies business, boy. It go boss. And it's you and I to catch in the long run. No more movies.
I know, understand what you're saying, you know.
Right. So have a conscience now, boy. Watch the movies and them the legit way, nah?
You don't know what you don't know, eh?
Welcome back, and thank you again for staying with us. Earlier, we spoke with Prime Minister Alan Chastney. A little later, we'll be speaking with Guyanese Prime Minister, that's Moses Nagamutu, to find out exactly how they are surviving this crisis. But we are continuing our conversation now with the country head of the IDB, as well as the chief economist attached to the Caribbean Development Bank, and we're looking at what's taking place now. You know, Justin, when you speak about the papers that you presented, when you look at the Caribbean economy, and I know that you spoke about lending agencies in particular, and Caribbean governments having conversations with lending agencies, do we have the local standing or the gravitas at this time to tell the lending agencies or to tell the credit rating agencies, listen, give us some breathing room at this time?
I think we do, Hima. What's important is that we need to speak as one. I think at this point in time in the Caribbean, it's so important for us to understand the importance of the regional integration movement and to come together as a region. Certainly if countries are going on the international stage and trying to speak on their own, they're not going to be heard. We need to do this at a regional level, and I think at the CARICOM level is so important. But let me just say that as we are considering what needs to happen after this pandemic, I think that the mandate for all of our leaders and all of our Caribbean economies right now must be about how we build resilience. And I'll be happy to speak about what measures I think that are required there. But I think that resilience must be our mantra as we come out of this pandemic.
Now, Rooster, you know, I know that the IDB released a bulletin today, and the use of technology was also highlighted in previous discussions that the IDB had, not just in relation to Trinidad and Tobago, but also regionally. Now, we are operating and living in an interesting space where connectivity, internet access, and Wi-Fi is not necessarily available in all islands. You have some parts of with simply no electricity. When you have different development scales in different islands in a region so diverse, are we running the risk of the most vulnerable simply being left behind?
Well, definitely, I would say this crisis has put in evidence the challenges of technology and technology adoptions that throughout the region. I would say not only just in the Caribbean. So this is an aspect that, I mean, how we are prepared to work, for instance, teleworking, how the companies and the public sector can actually adjust their policies, can work with a specific at a distance, you know, in terms of approval, e-signature. I mean, before, last year we were discussing about examples like Estonia, how the e-government can facilitate payments, you know, where citizens don't need to go to an office to pay taxes, etc. Collection that are not only help with the collection, but also help also in the now in a crisis like this, that they cannot actually be allowed to go and there. So I would say this will be a challenge, and actually IDV is working and trying to support this with different trainings, because it's a new normal, how we can do work at a distance with social distances, because we will need to live with this in a time period that we don't know how long will last. And we try to control how much the virus and how spread out it is, but this will take time to actually, all the borders will be open in different countries, and still until the vaccine maybe is not there, it will be a lot of things that we have to be transitioning and working, and technology will be crucial. That's why I was mentioning the private sector through the IDV Invest will be working with companies how to prepare for that time, because they need to adopt technology and they need to work to adopt these policies and new infrastructure in order to be prepared, as well as the governments as well.
Justin, I know you mentioned about resilience earlier, and I know as we look at the time window that is closing for the discussion, I want to talk about resilience and what will the post-COVID economy look like? What should we be doing now? In your paper, you also spoke about the fact that implementation is always an issue for the Caribbean. Considering that we know this, what needs to be done to ensure that we survive this?
Well, let me just summarize quickly what I think we need to do on resilience. I think we need to ensure that our macroeconomic environment is strong, that we're building in fiscal buffers, that we look at how we improve the business environment, that is to say, how we improve productivity and competitiveness. Thirdly, I think we need to look at our social issues, our human development. We're still lagging behind with respect to our human development. Too many young people are still unemployed, and our crime rates, we need to look at that. And of course, we live in quite a bad neighborhood. I always like to say we are visited by neighbors, and we give them names every year. That those are the storms and hurricanes that pass through. So that makes us even more vulnerable when we look at it from the environmental standpoint. But that means that we in the Caribbean, we know how we must build resilience. And in order to do that, Hema, in the paper, I have set out how I think we need to go about implementing this. There is an 8-step process that I've highlighted there that I've borrowed from the Malaysians and also from Michael Barber in the UK. And it simply says, look, as a country, we need to know what are the priority areas to do. St. Lucia's government, Alan Chastanet, who was on your program earlier, has done this very successfully in his country. You get at the cabinet level and you have the priorities. Then secondly, once you have those priorities set out, you then set up what's called laboratories to have the best people in the room. Put them in a room maybe for about 2 weeks to a month to come up with implementation plans. After you've come up with those implementation plans, you then have public consultations where the public says, okay, we like this or we don't. Can you tweak this? Then after you've done that, you then have a relentless focus on implementation. And what we've done in St. Lucia as a project is that we've set up a policy management and delivery unit in the Office of the Prime Minister, whereby they help the Prime Minister with the implementation of policy priorities. And we've done that successfully in St. Lucia. Then what's important here is that we have to have a greater level of accountability with respect to ministers who have responsibility for certain things. And that is the Prime Minister and the head of the policy and management and delivery unit meets with them quite regularly and discusses how things are progressing. If things aren't going well, what needs to be done?
Right.
And then finally, Hema, at the end of every year, we need to have a report card where we come back to the population and say, this is what we said we're going to do on January 2nd, and this is what we have managed to achieve or have not done on December 31st, and what are we going to do differently next year in order to make sure that we're on the right path? Okay. Because ultimately, we need to have buy-in across the political aisle so that everyone is on board as to where we want our countries to head. and then we have a relentless focus on implementation with a greater reliance on accountability. I think those are key things that we need to focus on now.
Bruce, as we wrap this discussion, I do want to ask, what makes an IDB loan different to any other loan from an international agency? And I'm asking this in the context that the Andean Bank recently gave a loan to the Trinidad and Tobago government. Would you say that less bureaucracy makes these loans a little more attractive to Caribbean governments? And that's my final question before we wrap this interview.
No, I mean, definitely what I think our value added and our differential is, I mean, the IDB group has a presence in all our countries, in all our 26 business countries. We have been the long-term financier and the leading financier in the region for more than 60 years. Our value added not only is our financial terms, and we can discuss how competitive we have 25 years long tenors, competitive pricing, but also is how we combine that with our know-how, our lesson learned, our advisory. It's not just providing financing, but it's also working together with the country, with the private sector, to work in an advisory to provide technical assistance, because our support in addition to the financial is how we monitor and we go together with the countries and to find the solutions and actually see the implementations throughout that time. And now I think just to say right now, I mean, as this is the size of the crisis is so high that now is the time also to work together in collaboration and in very good coordination with all the development banks and the bilateral agencies that are working to support the governments and the private sector. Because the resources are very scarce and we need to be very targeted and very focused and very strategic how we can work.
But I do want to thank you both very much for taking the time to share your expertise with our audience tonight. It was really appreciated, and looking at shedding some light on some of the challenges that we do face. And the IDB recently, this morning actually, released yet another bulletin. And also I would encourage you to read Dr. Ram's piece on the Caribbean's response to COVID-19. Thank you again. We take another short break, and when we come back, Guyana's Prime Minister joins us for a discussion. A country that was poised for so much growth. What does COVID-19 mean for all of their economic progress?
Right now, I want to believe it's empowerment you have.
Yes, always talking empowerment. That is me. And I also self-empowerment. I is a smoker, and the empowerment does help freshen my breath and take away all the smokiness.
So from eating your roti, they go for empowerment?
Yeah. It sort of keep the breath clean and smelling good.
Empowerment is very good. It is very useful.
And your name is Edith. Well, I guess you can have your empowerments and Edith too.
Empowerments by Diana.
Come to Homeland Marketing and discover our wonderful wrought iron designs, gates, tracks and guides, wheels, zinc hollow section, Makita tools and primer. Number 44 Montrose Main Road, Chaguanas. 3 buildings after the Chaguanas Medical Center heading east. Homeland Marketing, beautifying homes.
Get the nation's leading newspaper on the go by downloading the Digital Guardian app on your iOS or Android devices now and enjoy our special introductory subscription offer now on. The nation's first and best digital paper in an easy-to-read digital format. The Digital Guardian, Trinidad and Tobago's fastest growing, most subscribed, and most read digital paper. Stay on top with the market leader and don't miss a beat in today's fast-paced world. Go to Apple Store or Google Play and download now.
COVID-19 is on everyone's mind. What is the virus about? Why is it spreading so quickly? What can you do to prevent it? This is a serious virus, and only we can help prevent it from spreading. Find out how and more tips on flattening the curve on Ask the Doctor every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 p.m. We will answer your questions live with our special guest, Dr. Joel Tiluxing. Ask the Doctor only on CNC3.
Is your dog here?
Don't miss Fran Drescher as the Nanny, Sundays at 8:30 p.m., only on CNC3.
Okay, stop.
Is there a problem?
Yes, you. It's time for you to go.
Wait, did I do something wrong?
Not yet, but you are getting very close.
Don't miss Bob Hart's Abishola, Sundays at 7:30 p.m., only on CNC3.
Welcome back, Trinidad and Tobago. Now, despite the challenging political environment, the government of Guyana adopted policies to stop the spread of coronavirus. The main measures include, get this, the suspension of all school activities, the closure of 2 international airports, initially for a 2-week period, and currently that has been extended to May 1st. The granting of special powers to the Ministry of Health to prevent and control the spread of the disease, including designating special facilities to isolate the threat and also to look at the movement of at-risk and ill people. Now, on April 3rd, the government announced a month-long restriction on public gatherings across the nation as it was looking for what's taking place. Now, an oil-rich nation that was poised for phenomenal growth, that has since been revised. What does all of this mean for the South American nation? Joining us to discuss this issue and so much more, we have Prime Minister Moses Nagamutu. Prime Minister, good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Emma. Thank you for having me.
Now, obviously, the first big question, all eyes were on Guyana. There was such promise of growth. What has been the impact of COVID-19 on your economy?
Well, as you referred earlier, the World Bank has made a revision of the lofty ideal of 86% growth. It has now been revised downward to 51.2%. And obviously, with the COVID-19, we are going to have a downturn generally in the economy. Last year, we did 4.6% economic growth. We thought was very good compared to other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we were hoping that the economy would be buoyant with oil revenues. Now we have to expect less. But we do have a resilient economy. Our gold price is trending up, and we have quite a lot of gold. So we shouldn't be too worried about having revenues.
Are you hinging, Prime Minister, are you hinging your bets on gold? Because Guyana is a resource-rich nation. So I know that obviously the budgeted oil price that you have, there's speculation that the oil price will now go down to $40 or maybe even $20. Is it that you are now hinging your revenue stream on a gold price, which also is pretty volatile?
Well, I'm not saying that we're hinging, but I'm just pointing out to the possibility that where one sector of the economy would take a dip, we do have some ambition that we can be buoyant still. But of course, like all other Caribbean economies and economies in the world, we would have a slowdown, but we had not even anticipated that we could grow by 50%. When we were told about the 86% growth in a particular year, we felt that we had hit bonanza. We had survived with much less in the past. We have gone through very lean periods in our life, and we are looking towards the oil sector, but oil has to be complemented with the soil. We are rich, we have a diverse economy, we are rich in agriculture. Our rice production last year, for example, has touched one of the highest production, over 1 million ton of paddy and rice, and there's nothing to suggest that even COVID-19 has affected the rice sector.
Now, I know, looking at you talk COVID-19, you are in charge of the task force in Guyana. How is your health system dealing with COVID-19? Many countries are operating parallel systems. You had the St. Lucia Prime Minister earlier who said that they had to declare a state of emergency because they couldn't risk the health system being overburdened. How is Guyana dealing with this? Have you set up a parallel system?
Well, in the same way that St. Lucia has acted when we got our first imported case, who had since died, we set in train measures, national emergency health measures, one of which was to designate sections of our public hospital as a quarantine area as well as for hospitalization. But those the number of beds has been very restrictive. So we have now expanded to open a gymnasium as well as a dedicated hospital to be like a sanatorium that has been acquired and is being renovated. So we are preparing capacity, but if we had not taken the same or similar measures as St. Lucie did by enforcing a curfew and imposing restrictive measures, we probably would have been overwhelmed. Our system would have been challenged at this point in time.
I want to ask about the decision to close the borders, and that is a decision that no country takes lightly. How long will you keep the borders of Guyana closed for?
We have set a date to May 2nd. We are reviewing that constantly because we have a great influx of Venezuelans into our country. Today I've received a report after a COVID task force consultation that we had jumped by seven, in fact, persons. And I could imagine, I didn't receive all the details, but I know some the incidents of migrants from nearby country, particularly Venezuela, and some of them have been quarantined. They have given the medical personnel, medical providers resistance. They had to be handcuffed to their beds. And so closing the borders shows that we could restrict the imported cases and we could stop the community spread. So far, the analysis of the 55 cases are showing that while the original case was imported, we have quite a lot of community spread. And some of those persons have been interacting with cross-border immigrants. And so it was for us a difficult decision because we have Guyanese living in Venezuela, we have Guyanese living in Suriname, as well as in Brazil. But we have decided to close the border to any entry from these three countries.
Mr. Prime Minister, I want to ask, returning to the energy sector, and obviously I have to return to that because the world was excited about the prospects for Guyana. I think everyone kind of thought that it was Guyana's time at this time. Looking at COVID-19, what has been the immediate impact on the energy sector, the closing of the borders, looking at the supply chain disruptions? Have you seen reduced productivity? Have you seen international companies sending their people back?
Well, I expect, Hema, listening to your questions to Dr. Justin Ram and the IDB, and even Prime Minister Castanet, that you would come to the economics. And I was wondering when I listened earlier, I said, you might got your wrong man. You need economists to be interviewing this evening. Yeah, but listen, we do not detect any downturn in the oil and gas sector in production. Remember, these offshore activities, they're taking place 120 kilometers outside our shore. And they have their own methodologies. We have listed oil and gas as an essential sector. They're allowed to operate 24/7, as well as the onshore activities on the river fronts. Shipping lines have not been restricted. Port and wharves activities have not been curtailed. So we know of no measures that could affect production. However, we have seen the impact on the cutback in production as well as the fall in price. And we expect to have between 20 to 40% less revenue than we had anticipated. But nevertheless, if we are coming out from the nigger yard of yesterday, as Martin Carter wrote in his poem, and we have been accustomed to running a stringent economy with a lot of austerities in the past, I think we can accommodate the reality of post-COVID. And as I said, while our eyes are looking up towards the glorious days ahead for oil and gas, we are looking inward. We have a green development strategy.
You do have, I mean, you are lucky. You are more lucky than most because you do have a very resource-rich country. But I do want to ask, when you talk about a 20 to 40% drop in revenue, there were so many infrastructural projects going on in Guyana. Have you made a decision as to which of these projects will be stopped?
Well, almost all of these projects are near completion. Remember, some of these projects have been inherited from the previous, during the previous administration. And so we do not see any major disruption of ongoing projects, infrastructural projects. We have engagement with the IDB. You're interviewing the IDB person just now, and they have in the pipeline about 76 million US dollars that have been ready to be disbursed. Of course, our political challenges make these fiscal response difficult at this time, but we have been able to adapt to the changing circumstances and allow the investment to take place in medical-related institutions and facilities.
Mr. Prime Minister, I want to ask you to just hold the line because we have to take a very short break. When we come back, I would like to expand on the fiscal measures and maybe even ask whether the corporate sector is rising to the challenge, but do stay with us.
Recession have you down? Don't lose hope. Head on down to Tire Clinic for the recession deals. Big savings with a road hazard warranty on Dunlop, Sumitomo, and Falcon tires. Available at Tire Clinic, Couva, Chaguanas, and Pleasant Park. Tire Clinic, a tire for every need.
We are continuing a conversation with Guyana's Prime Minister Moses Nagamutu. Prime Minister Nagamutu, you mentioned fiscal measures. If you had to say briefly, what are some of the adjustments that Guyana's government had to make to ensure that the economy does not go into freefall?
Well, you mentioned the private sector and the private sector's role. The banking sector has made given incentives to private sectors to import, to have remission in loans. The government itself has given incentive for importation of medical-related items, and there are measures taken effect among the disadvantaged group. For example, there has been a recall of VAT on water and electricity. We have in the pipeline some social impact measures, such as granting of vouchers to the most vulnerable. Today's meeting I hinted at earlier was with the Minister of Finance, considering a range of measures to be implemented. For example, while we have rotation in offices, most of the offices are working remotely. There has been guaranteed of wages to the public service, that no one would suffer loss of income while they stay at home, and that those measures would go right into May. So we have not had any cutback in the term of the business environment. The banks are open, the insurance company, they restricted the hours. Shopping takes place during the day. Their markets are open. The supermarkets as well. The food chain is moving apace.
Right.
So activities are taking place. So we are not fearful of a free fall in our economy, because the major sector of our economy, the productive sector, has not been affected.
Let me ask you this, and I know we just have, 2 minutes again, Mr. Prime Minister, but we have a lot of Trinidad and Tobago companies operating particularly in the energy sector. With the travel restrictions, have you seen particularly the CARICOM companies not be able to continue productivity or as productive as they would have been in Guyana?
Like all other companies, Trinidadians who are here, they continue in their businesses. As I said, they're mostly involved in the oil and gas sector, and they have ancillary work. They are operating as essential services. In regards to travel, our border is closed to international travel. Workers can leave. Trinidadians who are working here can return home if they want to, but it would be difficult for them to return in this margin that we have set ourselves, the outer limit initially of May 2nd. If they were to come and considerations being given to on a one-by-one basis, then we would have to place them in quarantine. They will have to be quarantined. They would have to have restrictive measures. But we have not opened our borders to receive persons coming in from outside.
Right.
They would make sure
Now, I know we're out of time, but what would you like to say to Trinidad and Tobago? I know, as you've heard all of our discussions this evening, we started with the Prime Minister of St. Lucia. We had representatives from the Caribbean Development Bank and the IDB. Guyana, who is considered now to be the gem of the Caribbean and CARICOM region, poised for so much growth. You admitted that there's a 20 to 40% decline in your revenue, but you've said that you've seen bad days before, so you're confident. 10 seconds, your closing comments to the people of Trinidad and Tobago.
Well, we are all in this together. We have gone through a rough time, and the Caribbean has bonded and banded together. So I don't think that we will face this as isolated countries. We are here with a complementary economy. We have a very strong and resilient Caribbean community. We have to keep ourselves together as a Caribbean people and weather the storm. If we can help each other, we should do so. We will definitely be reaching out to you, to people of Trinidad, as you have reached out to us in the past.
Sure.
And we are hoping that we can ride this storm successfully.
Mr. Prime Minister, let me ask you specifically about the banking sector and the corporate sector in Guyana. Have they risen to the challenge? Are they doing CSR initiatives to help the Guyanese people and Guyana's government?
Yes, we have started the distributing hampers, care hampers, we call them, for vulnerables. We have the private sector has been contributing part of the National Emergency Operations Center, the Salvation Army. Quite a number of civic organizations have thrown themselves into this. We have distributed to vulnerable communities. We'll continue to do so, and we expect that this will be not only a government matter, this will be for all of Guyanese, every single sector. All of us are in it together.
Sure.
And I think we're doing a good job so far.
Mr. Prime Minister, I do want to thank you. I'm Hema Ramki. Soon we've come to the end of this discussion. The new Caribbean norm, we've spoken with 2 prime ministers as well as the major regional banks in the Caribbean space. I'm Hema Ramki. Soon do have a safe and blessed night. Stay home to save lives. And remember, we are in this together.
You're watching CNC3.